you all a very happy Diwali on behalf of Aspen Institute India. I hope all of you had a wonderful time. We have the honor today of having amidst us Dr. Sonam Kinga, Chairperson of the National Council, Parliament of Bhutan, and Mr. Bejayant Panda, Honorable Member of Parliament, Government of India. I would like to invite Dr. Kinga and Mr. Panda on stage. And we look forward to a very, very interesting session on democratizing Shangri-La. And sir, if you could both come on the stage, please. In the meantime, may I request all of you to please turn your phones on silent or switch it off. Now, without any further delay, I would like to hand over the stage to Mr. Panda.
Dr. Kinga, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure and honor to chair this session with Dr. Sonam Kinga, Chairperson of the National Council, Parliament of Bhutan. I thought I'd just take a couple of minutes just to make a little introduction. And I want to start with that description that was given of me as a member of Parliament of India, Government of India. I'd like to point out that I'm in the opposition of India. And the true beauty about democracies is that you can indeed be in the opposition and say what you like, and have eminent and interesting people listen to you. Sometimes democracy is not given the due importance that it ought to get. And in recent times, I've had occasion many times to talk about the strengths of democracy and to face the challenges that we face, some of which are indeed the makings of democracy, such as a slower decision-making process, by trying to fix it rather than to wish for alternatives. And I've had occasion to quote Churchill several times that democracy is the worst of all the systems out there, except for all the other ones. In this context, I promised you I would not be long-winded. I will wind up in the next 60 seconds. In this context, I think what is happening in Bhutan is a wonderful example of how in one of the most troublesome regions in the world, despite housing the world's largest democracy, South Asia has housed many non-democracies, many which have transitioned or are trying to transition or have had several failed attempts and are still trying again. In this backdrop, for the Kingdom of Bhutan to voluntarily, without any public pressure, to start making that transition speaks not only of the vision of the leaders of the country that have made this happen, but also of the people that have partaken in that system and have now gone through 2 elections. I look forward to Dr. Kinga's talk, after which we will have a Q&A session, chance to interact with him. There is a long list of accomplishments. I think many of you have the description with you. Suffice it to say that as Chairperson of the National Council, he plays a very crucial role in one of the youngest democracies in the world, very crucially important to us in India because of the example that it sets in the neighborhood and because also, of course, of so many strategic concerns. So without further ado, I think all of us are keen to listen to Dr. Kinga, and I welcome you, sir, first to India, to Delhi, and to deliver your address. Thank you.
Thank you. Put on the paper. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Good evening, Honorable J. Panda, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and indeed, very close friends from Bhutan whom I didn't know were in New Delhi today. I'm deeply honored to be here today to share with you a story on Bhutan's transition to democracy, which happened 5 years ago. But first, I would like to thank Aspen Institute and Thimpu Seminars for the partnership in creating this platform and giving me the opportunity to share some of my thoughts. And I would like to thank all of you for taking interest and being here this evening to listen to me. What I intend to do tonight is examine how and why Bhutan's transition to democracy has been distinct. What have been our experiences of democracy in the last 5 years, and what are some of the key challenges that confront us as we embark on a process not of transition, but of consolidating democracy. But I understand that most of our guests here tonight may not necessarily know of Bhutan much. So, Honorable Chair, allow me to begin by making a very brief introduction about my country. We will have to look at the slides over there. So the lights, I think, are dim enough to get the... Bhutan is indeed a very small kingdom located between two large neighbors, India and China. Its area is little over 38,000 square kilometers. But what does that mean? It means Bhutan is maybe about 80 times smaller than India, about 250 times smaller than China. But that is when we think of area as a multiple of length by breadth. But Bhutan is full of mountains, and sometimes if you take the hypotenuse factor, it could be a large country if we had the technology to flatten it. But that is neither interest nor the intent. So we remain a small country of about 700,000 people, less than 1 million, but with a large diversity of about 24 different ethno-linguistic groups. The population is largely Buddhist, but with a sizable Hindu following. About 68% of the people depend still today on subsistence agriculture for livelihood. Generation and sale of hydroelectricity constitutes the primary economic activity, followed by construction and tourism sectors. Our GDP today is about rupees 113 billion. A government in Bhutan, a Buddhist government, was first founded in 1626 by a person called Shabdrung Namgyal, whom you see on the screen over there. His Buddhist government, not a theocratic government, but what I call an ecclesiocratic government, unified different valley-based village polities, which actually existed for 700 years, and by the time of his passing away in 1651, created a distinct Bhutanese national polity. And I'm sure most of you would know that around that time in the Himalayan region, a pan-national state did not exist then. But somehow Bhutan came into being. Initially, sovereignty was located in the founder, the Shabdrung. But later it came to be embodied in his reincarnations and reincarnations of his sons, who reigned for nearly 250 years. By saying that, I'm skipping a lot of history. However, actual power gradually came to be exercised by provincial governors and lay officials, and the reincarnations of the founder and his son, who served as the sovereigns, were merely put on the throne by these officials and governors in order to legitimize their rules. As a result, what happened was factionalism, internal strife, contest for power, and political instability characterized this 2.5 century of reign by what we call reign of multiple reincarnations. The monarchy, which was founded in 19 107, just over 100 years ago, brought an end to this period of political instability and infighting, and once again unified the country. The most important thing that I would like to make here is that monarchy that was founded in Bhutan in the 20th century was not a monarchy based on the divine right of kings, as monarchs conventionally are perceived to be, but on a contract, a written agreement signed among the founding monarch, provincial rulers, and community representatives, and that document you see is the document, a founding contract drawn between the founding monarch and others, symbolizing the founding of monarchy. Since then, in the last 100 years, monarchy came to symbolize change and progress as successive kings initiated social, economic, and political reforms. Monarchy became synonymous with Bhutan's modernity. His Majesty King Jigme Khyentse Namgyal Wangchu, the present king enthroned in 2008, is the fifth in the Wangchuk dynasty. For most of our history, Bhutan followed a conscious policy of isolation. It was never colonized. It did not get engaged in major regional and global events such as the Great Game or the Cold War. We initiated planned socio-economic development programs in the 1960s with the assistance of the government of India. And in fact, there has been unprecedented growth in Bhutanese economy, but our socio-economic development was largely focused on basic needs of people such as water, sanitation, health, education, electricity, transport, etc., rather than on industrialization. Economic development took place with minimal industrialization. Therefore, Bhutan's culture, tradition, lifestyle, including our natural environment, managed to survive thus far as distinct aspects of our modernity. Now, these provided a framework, psychological or otherwise, for imagining Bhutan as a Shangri-La by those who believe they still continue to discover and experience Bhutan as Shangri-La-like. Shangri-La's destiny with democracy began on 9th December 2008 when the fourth king, the father of the present king, abdicated at the height of his power, fame, and success after reigning for 34 years. Since he was only 51 years old when he abdicated, he could have actually continued reigning as a constitutional monarch, since the constitution which was drafted under his command requires a king to abdicate at the age of 65. So he was just 51, not 65. Yet he chose to abdicate voluntarily, signaling the beginning of a new era of Bhutan's political modernity. Now, the rarity of such voluntary abdication does not find scholarly explanations in the field of what we call transitology, a body of scholarship devoted to studying regime change in the world. So, for example, one of the scholars asks, perhaps the most difficult prerequisite is the authoritarian regime's willingness to initiate transition to democracy. Another scholar notes that the most difficult question is what would make the dominant groups of the regime decide to begin the process of transition, or perhaps more realistically, what would make them tolerate any articulation or pressure for transition. This Shangri-La, Bhutan, democratizing, teased conventional models and experiences of democratic transition based on experiences of regime change in many other countries. I would like to examine some such models and experience and discuss how Bhutan's experience cannot be situated in them. Based on the modernization theory of 1950s, which was built upon experiences largely of Western nations, liberal democracy was projected to be the modern mode of organizing socio-political life. Modernists argue that societies underwent progressive stages of economic development. Societies were not seen as a democracy candidate until they fulfilled some basic preconditions, such as a rise in income and GDP. One argued that Only a country that attempts a transition to democracy when it has a per capita GDP between $3,000 and $6,000 will be successful. So democracy in the view of modernists was not pre-development, post-development. Their primary argument was that economic development brings along with it social and political institutions of modern Western society and therefore creates an alternative center of power which is able to challenge state power. These arguments, however, do not explain Bhutan's case. Although economic development has taken place, as I mentioned earlier, there is no causal link between economic development in Bhutan and democratization. In fact, political liberalization and reforms began a decade earlier than economic development in Bhutan when the third king established the first National Assembly in 1953, whereas socio-economic modernization began about a decade later in 61-62. Besides, when Bhutan embarked on the path of democratic transition in 2008, it did not fulfill those conditions that the modernists identify. It was a least developed country with 68% of people engaged in subsistence farming, and the per capita income in 2006 was US dollar 1,321, which is far less than the benchmark that the modernists set. Now, another model of regime change and democratization proposed has been what is known as the elites' bargain or pact. Its advocate argued that a political community or a nation must exist in the first place before a transition is possible. Then in that community, that nation, there is a period of a long, protracted struggle, not seeing an end to the struggle. Bargain and negotiations take place among the elites who make compromises on differences and then agree to bargain and share power. One scholar calls this transition through transaction as much as the elites pact or bargain. So this is said or argued to be one of the linchpins of triggering democratic transition. The Bhutanese elite is a very small, homogeneous group, and most of the traditional nobilities belong to eminent Buddhist lineages, live in different communities scattered across the country. Those who made it to the elite rank were part of the state, serving as ministers, senior public servants in different branches of the state. And there was no other elite group with significant power or resources to be able to take on the state. Hence, there was no compact or bargain among Bhutanese elite, let alone a protracted struggle in the national community to trigger democratic transitions. Another model attempts to situate or locate the cause of transition to certain internal, external, and regional factors, what's known as the imperatives. So let us begin by looking at the internal factors. One of the most important internal factors that trigger the democratization process is said to be a regime's loss of domestic legitimacy. And that loss occurs when the regime fails to deliver economic development or political performance. Rather than suffer any decline in legitimacy, the Bhutanese monarchy has been the agency of socio-economic development and in fact very successful at delivering that. The last 3.5 decades during the reign of the former king saw high increases in literacy rates, enhanced access to social services, modernization of transport communication, development of trade, industry, promotion of public education, mass media, and significant political reforms that I will highlight later. Advocates of this model also argue that the success of delivering development can also trigger democratic transitions, not just failure, but success too can trigger transition. This is to say that as long as a regime is authoritarian, democratization is inevitable, irrespective of its success or failure in delivering economic and political development. Success in delivering economic development and a concomitant growth in the middle class are said to push democratization process forward. Now, if you look at Bhutan, Our socio-economic development took place, as I mentioned earlier, with minimal industrialization. The focus was on basic needs of health, education, transport, communication, and there hasn't been a major labor force movement from the agriculture sector to the industrial sector. The middle and working class constitute a very small section of the Bhutanese society. For example, in 2007-8, when the transition took place, only about 3% of the total national revenue were contributed by the manufacturing sector. Most industries in which these people work were established by the state, and the state's share in these industries is also quite high. So hence the middle and the working class largely depend on public sector for their well-being, and then did not become a force advocating regime change. Another internal factor of democratization is said to be class conflict and peasants' movement. As modernization proceeds, it's argued that the size of the peasants decline, and then they come to depend on the landed elite. Industrialization and urbanization creates a working class of bourgeoisie. Class conflict is said to lead to a violent revolution that triggers regime change. But again in Bhutan, peasants constitute 68% of the population, and in 2008, nearly 30% of them lived below the poverty line. However, most of these peasants own some agricultural lands. Those who do not have enough land holdings can apply to the king for land grants and titles. Peasants also have alternative aid and arrangements such as sharecropping to meet subsistence needs. On the one hand, peasants have not only some access to source of subsistence livelihood, but their tax obligations are very negligible. On the other hand, the state's budget for rural development, social service, and infrastructure development is quite significant. Therefore, the basis for a peasants' movement advocating regime change did not exist in Bhutan. Let us look at what called the external factors. An important one is said to be peaceful external pressures applied on a regime by way of diplomacy, economic assistance, and sanctions. Aid is made conditional to political reforms, and where it doesn't work, economic sanctions are imposed. The Bhutanese government and the monarchy was never under any international pressure to democratize its political system. Political reforms had been an ongoing process. As a least developed country, Bhutan's development partners, particularly India, provide important source of investment capital and resources. And development partners have never used the leverage of assistance to force political change within Bhutan. In fact, development partners have repeatedly expressed their satisfaction with the degree of utilization of aid in Bhutan. Another external factor identified is democracy assistance. This includes assistance to strengthen democratic institutions, civil society, monitoring of elections, governance, etc. Elections are said to be the most important entry point for democratic assistance. And in 2008, when we started democratic transition, His Majesty the Fourth King commanded that all expenses for elections must be met from internal resources. This was an important consideration to ensure that our transition process, particularly the elections, remain free of external pressures. But I must put on record that we did receive generous assistance of the government of India in supplying the electronic voting machines, which have been used to very successful degree. Forceful democratization is said to be the last resort that external actors apply to a defined regime. But a government formed through external force and coercion faces challenge of legitimacy both by people at home and the international community. And in Bhutan's case, no such force or coercive power was applied. Lastly, an important regional factor has been identified as membership to regional organizations. So a criterion for admission as members in such organizations like the EU, the OAS, the OAU are said to be the requirement for a candidate country to initiate democratic reforms, respect fundamental rights, institute democratic practices, and as part of accession to these bodies, the countries are said to require democratic institutions and practice to be in place. We all know Bhutan is a founding member of SAARC, and the SAARC Charter does not require its members to be democracies. Its primary objective is to enhance regional, social, economic, and technical cooperations. So for all these reasons that I mentioned, it is problematic to locate, to situate Bhutan's democratic transition in prevailing moods and experiences of regime change. The question that then arises is, what triggered Bhutan's transition? In our view, in Bhutan, it was a critical decision of leadership. And there are two instances in this so-called transitology where I came across two scholars who attributed democratization process and regime change to leadership. One called it transformational leadership, and the other called it innovative leadership. Democratization theory has not paid sufficient attention to the role of leaders in democratization process. The next most important question that arises is, why did His Majesty, King Jigme Singye Wangchu, decide to introduce parliamentary democracy? I must mention that this was the culmination of decades of political reforms he initiated and was not something that came out of the blue. When he ascended the throne in 1972, there was already a legislature called the National Assembly, most of whose members were directly elected. But His Majesty committed himself to deepening political reform process by establishing first grassroots development organizations, which became predecessors of today's local governments. Decentralization became the defining political signature of his reign. In 1998, 10 years before we introduced parliamentary democracy, he had already stepped aside from being the head of government and had the National Assembly elect a new cabinet based on a fixed 5-year term. In 2001, he commanded the drafting of a written constitution. So all these reforms were initiated when there was really no popular demand. The question is, why democratize when there was no demand? In order to answer this, we must draw our analysis from His Majesty's own reasoning, which was, in fact, an articulation of his vision for democracy for Bhutan. What are the constituents of this vision? One of his frequent and repeated public pronouncements has been to say that the future of the country lies in the hands of the people. And that was a very thoughtful, visionary, and a bold statement for a monarch to frequently say to the people. He has said that the people must assume responsibility of governance for themselves. He also said that it is important to trust the people and to have faith in their integrity and capability. Second, he said that the inherent weakness of a monarchy was its dependence on one person, and it's the king himself saying it. He said the intentions of kings may be good, but what if they change? He said, the flaw in the monarchy is that you reach very high and important positions not due to merit, but due to birth. The need, therefore, for institutions and a political system that rests on the wisdom of all people rather than one person. Third, he said that Bhutan needs a dynamic political system to adapt to a changing society. That political system must suit the needs of the Bhutanese people and had to be homegrown based on our own history, tradition, culture, and not something that replicates an imported model. Fourth, maybe close to what Churchill said, as Honorable J. Panda mentioned, democracy, he said, was a viable political institution that could fulfill the aspirations of the Bhutanese people. If democracy had not worked elsewhere, it was not due to its weakness, but due to abuses of democracy by those in power. In April and May 2007, that is 6 years ago, His Majesty the King, the present King, led the Bhutanese to participate in 2 rounds of practice elections called mock elections before we actually did the real elections, which took place about 5-6 months later. In December 2007, elections to the upper house, and then in March 2008, elections to the lower house. The common understanding of democracy at that point of time was that it was a gift of the 4th king. How different social groups interpreted it was not easily discernible then. 5 years later, when the second elections were held a few months ago, certain ideas of democracy have become more crystallized. and I will try to share these ideas and perspectives based on the experiences of the last 5 years. Let me begin with the peasants. Their perspective of democracy remains developmental. The Bhutanese state, embodied by the monarchy, thus far was a development state. The monarchy, as I said, has been the agency of socio-economic development. So people's perception of the monarchical state has been one of a modernizer, of a developer. The democratic state also continues to be perceived and experienced as a development state. And in fact, the intensity of rural development projects of the last 5 years have further enhanced this image and increased expectations. Bhutan's small but growing urban middle class do not dismiss or undermine the importance of development perspectives, but puts far more emphasis on constitutionalism and rule of law. This has been an important development in the last 5 years. The middle class has been voicing strong concerns over key national issues such as corruption, unemployment, economy, and to some degree, foreign policy. Although the middle class is small, its views and opinions are having important influence on public policies and also on the electoral process. The media, both mainstream and social, have become an important means of articulating alternative opinions, and largely by the middle class. So a good indicator of democracy striking root in Bhutan has been the boldness with which the media has been able to publish critical views and investigative stories, exposing corrupt and unethical practices that prompted actions of agencies like the Anti-Corruption Commission. The monastic community constitutes an important social group. They had representation in the previous legislature. The Constitution provides for separation of religion and politics and requires religious personalities to remain above politics. Now, the Election Commission has interpreted this constitutional provision by not extending voting rights to monks. So in 2008, there were members of monastic community who expressed views that they were being excluded from the democratic process. But there were also those from within the monastic community who thought that this was a good arrangement since they could remain free from being politicized by associating with candidate or political parties. In the eyes of the monastic community, a democratic government would continue supporting the flourishing of the Buddha Dharma. As Bhutan's spiritual heritage, the state continues to provide adequate resources for the upkeep of the monastic body. But similar needs are being increasingly asked for by members of non-state monastic communities. So this image of the state as the patron of the Buddha Dharma is also being carried forward in democratic Bhutan. Within the parliament, democracy has played out as a process of negotiating contested ideas among members, between the two houses, and between the executive and the legislature. Disputes over bills and disagreements over key issues have seen heated but healthy debates. Major differences and debates have centered on issues like the primacy of parliament over executive and different interpretations of the constitution. Democracy came to be perceived and experienced as a space for renegotiating social relations and power dynamics. What are some of the important challenges to consolidate democracy in Bhutan? In his address to the first parliament in 2008, His Majesty the King said, "As King, henceforth it is my sacred duty to ensure the success of our new democracy so that it will serve to fulfill the aspirations of our people always." One of the most important challenges for Bhutan and the Bhutanese people will be to think of democracy not as an alternative to the successful monarchy, but rather as a site for the success of our democracy. Democracy did not develop in opposition to the monarchical state. Rather, the monarchy gave birth to democracy. Democracy is about empowering people. Local governments risk being seen or perceived and used as another bureaucratic agency of the central government, but they are constitutionally autonomous. That autonomy in both decision-making and financial resources has to be promoted. The danger otherwise is that of the growth of a patron-client relationship between the central and local governments, whereby the allegiance of the local governments and patronage of the central government would determine public policy and resource allocation, and we do not think that's very healthy. A rather unhealthy trend in the last 5 years has been instances of labeling groups or institutions with differing views as disloyal and unpatriotic for not doing the government's line of thinking. Not the monarchy's line of thinking, but the government's line of thinking. Democratic politics and discourse should not be framed along binary opposites of good, evil, patriotic, unpatriotic, loyal, disloyal. Rather, different players in institutions need to be seen and accepted as playing their legitimate oversight and check and balance functions. The political space to accommodate dissenting and alternative views has to be nurtured and further promoted. Electoral corruption can become a major challenge in the process of our democratic consolidation. Bhutan is a very small country, as I discussed earlier, with a smaller voting population. So it will not be very difficult with people or groups or institutions with significant resources to buy voters and influence electoral outcomes. Voter education and stringent laws concerning electoral corruptions are priority issues, and the Parliament is discussing that. Although economic development, as I said in the beginning, is not a necessary precondition for democratization, a democracy that does not do well in terms of economic growth and employment generation may undermine people's faith in democratic politics and institutions. Some of the biggest issues at the moment in Bhutan are liquidity, credit crunch in the financial sector, rising national debt, inflation, and a growing youth unemployment. Benefits of economic growth have to be spread across. Growing income disparities may generate social grievances and dissent that could challenge our democratic consolidation process. The most important challenge for consolidating democracy is citizens' education and understanding about democratic processes, institutions, and indeed their rights and duties. Unless the people are aware of their rights, duties, opportunities of participation in public life, and opportunities of influencing public discourse and public policies, democratic consolidation will remain problematic. Voter education conducted by the Election Commission thus far has largely been focused on technical and procedural aspects. So there is a need for a dedicated institution and a movement that will engage in wholesome education of voters as a routine activity beyond being fixated to election seasons. But then again, it is not fair to say voter education is required for voters alone. It's required equally for leaders and parliamentarians. An even greater challenge is how contests for control of government by candidates and political parties could sideline national issues and focus on concerns of partisan groups, vested interest, and short-term gains of power. For a small country like Bhutan, such developments could be destabilizing and defeat the very purpose of democracy. In conclusion, I would like to say that Bhutan is democratizing at a pace and in a manner we chose. However, elected leaders, and that apply to myself, in this important phase of democratic consolidation, has the great responsibility of establishing the right institutions and right practices, setting right precedents in terms of the intent of policies and legislations, and conducting public service in a manner that does not become the object of cynicism, distrust, and apathy. Bhutan will continue to draw inspirations and strength from the monarchy in the process of democratic consolidation. His Majesty the King is the symbol of unity of this small but largely diverse country. In the vicissitudes of democratic politics, characterized by elections, changes in governments, contestation for resources and entitlements, monarchy will symbolize certainty and continuity. It will continue to represent equity, justice, and national community. Thank you for your attention.
Honorable Dr. Kinga, thank you for what can only be described as that magisterial presentation on Bhutan's democratization, putting it in the context of the theories of democratization and the actual steps taken, the actual practice of what has happened in Bhutan. and most importantly, explaining to us how it was not due to one of the various constraints that usually leads to democracy, but a series of choices and visionary leadership that has led to this. I was intrigued when we were talking a little bit earlier. The population of Bhutan is about a third of the typical Indian constituency's population, and we have 543 of those. And yet, when you were discussing about the challenges that democracy poses to Bhutan, each one of those could just as easily apply to India. So it seems there is something about democracy which transcends size, which transcends age. We are well into our 6th decade of democracy, and we still face some of those challenges. And yet I think Bhutan is lucky in that it has people such as you who can only be described as Renaissance men. Although I didn't go through your profile because it has been distributed to the audience, but you've been a research scholar, you've been a social worker, you've been a civil servant, you've been a journalist, you've been an author, and now a political leader. Such a background can only bode well for Bhutan. I'm going to ask you one question to get the ball rolling, and then I'm going to open up the floor for the audience to take this on. The one phrase I was looking for some enlightenment on was gross national happiness. And I would like to ask your thought on how that unique concept, which has been so well championed by His Majesty the former king, and has champions for that philosophy throughout the world. How is that faring in the light of competitive democratic politics? Are there pressures for extra efforts on sheer materialist objectives of economic growth vis-a-vis other social objectives? How is that playing out?
Thank you, Chair. Just to begin, you mentioned about a typical Indian constituency being about 2 million, 2.5 million, and Bhutan's population being less than 1 million. Now, Arun Kapoor and I have this very interesting conversation not very long ago, where I say I represent the largest constituency in Bhutan, but we still refuse to talk about the population size. It's about 63,000 people. 2 years ago, there was a proposal, a demand by a community and an initiative of the government to build a highway crossing a high mountain pass in order to shorten and lessen the distance travel time. But unfortunately, that happened to be passing through what we call a tiger's corridor. This may seem not much of an issue for debate in many countries, and there are not many tigers in the world too. But it provoked a fierce debate between conservationists, environmentalists, and the policymakers, including the communities, as to whether the road for the communities take primacy over a corridor for tigers movement. Gross national happiness, Honorable Panda, has been a vision advocated in the early 70s by His Majesty, the fourth king. What does it really mean? His statement has been quite simple, that human happiness depends on not just material well-being, but spiritual and emotional well-being as well. When I made up my presentation, I made very brief references to Bhutan's socio-economic development process. Gross national happiness posits and advances a new modernity for Bhutan, where there is a place for culture and tradition, where there is a place for environment. The shedding of tradition and dismissal of environmental concerns are not seen as having a place in Bhutan's modernity, and that is key to understanding GNH. A holistic range of needs from education, health, culture, good governance, constitutes what we call gross national happiness. And of course, the academic debate has extended its constituents beyond what we call the 4 pillars to the 9 domains. But the essential ingredient of it is that human happiness depends on a holistic range of things where emotional, spiritual, and environmental well-beings occupy a primary position. As I said earlier, this in Bhutanese discourse and conversations, this may not come out as GNH influencing public policy and legislation, but in the articulation of issues, in the articulation of values of peasants, of monks, of bureaucrats, of industrial workers, the conscience informed by this concept does have an impact on how we do our public policies and legislation. I'll end with one anecdote. In 2009, the Ministry of Agriculture proposed a revision in the Livestock Act. We have every month some holy days, like the 15th, the 10th day, the 15th day, the 30th day. And there are also 2 holy months, like the 1st month and the 4th month, where import of meat is banned. The Agriculture Ministry wanted to propose an amendment saying that anyway everyone consumes meat in this, I mean, we have been consuming meat, now there are more consumption, so it is better in the context of increasing tourism to Bhutan to serve more fresh meat than having animals slaughtered months before and then freezing the meat. A group of old women decided to walk into the Parliament House. It was 2009, and it was a very important development. A very religious group of old women seeking parliamentarian support against this amendment. And in fact, this group of a few women and others, including the MPs, carried forward a spiritual sort of a religious sentiment and values that acted against the amendment of this bill and which could not be passed. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. As I open up the floor for questions, do we have microphones? Yes, I'll request you to allow me to moderate. And also 2 more requests. If you'd identify yourself and keep your comment or question brief, please. Here, to begin with.
Thanks. Victor Mallet from the Financial Times. You sort of alluded to this, but I wonder if you could tell us how society is changing rather than just politics, and what role the government, the monarchy, the establishment tries to play in affecting that, in influencing that. It might be in promoting change, it might be in preventing change, I don't know. In most societies where the economy modernizes, you tend to see quite dramatic social changes, and I just wondered if that's the case in Bhutan and how the establishment tries to influence that process, which is probably inevitable, but and what form do the changes take? Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Change of society is a dynamic process that is neither deliberately engineered nor mechanisms put in place to alter it, or prevent it rather in your language. Major differentiation in social categorization and groupings began to take place after 1960s and 70s. But there has been a kind of a sustained composition in the heterogeneity of the social group because of minimal industrialization, as I said earlier, and because the focus of socio-economic development has been largely on social sectors. However, 2 primary causes have seen a growth and differentiation along the social structures. First, education. What education has done is, as is the case in many other countries, got the new generation of Bhutanese into schools. And the kind of knowledge, skills they acquire does not necessarily redirect the future of the youths back to the village and the farms. As such, they look for a career, earlier largely in the civil service, now in the corporate and the private sector, and with that too, not meeting demands for jobs, alternative sources are being explored. But what you see is a movement of a generation of Bhutanese away from the farms to new sectors of employment. What this also suggests is that the monastic community, which I mentioned is an important social group, also finds less entrants in terms of novices. We have a policy of what we call no child left behind, which means not much child for the monastery either. As a result, the composition of the monastic community, which is an important social group, stays challenged. Although industrialization and urbanization has taken pace only recently now, and there has not been major labor displacement from the agriculture sector to the tertiary industrial sectors, it is happening now. It is happening not because of experiences of conventional economic development, but because of a specific set of challenges in community life in villages. So for example, the single most important issue in village communities today is what we define as human-wildlife conflict, where agriculture produces are being increasingly rampaged upon, destroyed by wild animals. Legislations, strategies and initiatives to handle that has not been making an impact, and despite the perseverance of the farmers in producing foods, the harvest they eventually have is a minuscule share of what they would have really obtained. As a result, people are moving into towns seeking alternative lifestyles, alternative occupations. Because of opportunities also in the corporate sector, as I briefly alluded to, beyond the civil service, the middle class and the lower middle class or working class is also expanding. So the composition of Bhutanese society, which traditionally by 1960s would have been the bureaucracy, traditional bureaucracy, the monks, the monastic community, and the peasants, a three-tier composition now sees increasing fragmentation and differentiation. Thank you.
Gentleman here, and after that, the gentleman in the back near the cameras. I'll try to come to you.
My name is Vinod Sehgal. I head Eco Monitor Society, which deals with the demographic ecological interface globally. My question follows that of the first speaker. There are two extremes, diametrically opposed factors working in what you call the gross national product, your country's gross national happiness, and at the other extreme, gross national pollution, as in China, which will fast come to India sooner rather than later. Now, in practically all cases where the middle classes have increased and improved economically, there's hardly any exception. The model for them, including in your cities in Bhutan, is the Western model, American model. So it's only a matter of time before the GNP, as VI said it, overtakes GNH. What is your view on that?
Thank you. I think that has been seen as one of the most important challenges, not just in the process of democratization, but for the Bhutanese society as a whole. And influences of globalization, more so as more and more young Bhutanese and families get exposed to and bombarded by 43 to 53 channels of television channels, largely packed with advertisements. A consumerist inclination and habit is something that we really cannot avoid. What do we do about it? The entry point is not try and ban it, such as TV advertisement. It's really one of the first issues we discussed in 2009 but didn't really make a headway was how do we control TV channels? We do not ban it, but is there an opportunity for us to selectively allow? But then that would have been something very biased, partisan. Then we said, as an example, should we not encourage advertisements on the only national TV as a public broadcaster. That didn't really make much headway, and the debate kind of got subdued. So the means for us, besides crafting policies and legislations that will address this, is two: largely education. Value education has been highlighted as one of the key approaches in dealing with many other issues, including this one. On the other hand, the interface between the bastion or the source of our societal values, which is the monastic community, the monastic institutions and the practices, the decision makers, and the society needs to be continually reinforced and revisited in order to create a flow of energy, if I may call it that way, that would positively form the bedrock of individual or societal conscience that will always place primacy over environment, over tradition, culture. But right now it's too difficult to say whether we'll succeed or not. But at least the good thing is that we recognize that this is the challenge, that is the problem, and that there is a will and an intent to address this. Thank you, sir.
Dr. Kinga, this is Dr. Sarojit Dudeja. Can you share your thoughts about your recent leanings toward China? Its choices or compulsion?
I'm sorry, sir?
Leaning towards China.
Leading towards China.
Leaning, shifting.
Oh, leaning. Okay.
Towards China.
Okay. I would actually like you to qualify how you come to the conclusion of leaning towards China, but for lack of time, let me just pick it up from here. The map that I showed, but even without it, all of you know that Bhutan, again, is a very small country located between two giants in all sense. And by giants, I do not really present a negative picture. It's two large countries. China and India are geographic neighbors, and geography is something that we cannot redraw boundaries or change neighbors. These are realities, and as we progress, this is a reality we have to live on. There has been discussions, there has been views expressed about certain actions or inactions of the previous government that suggested or that were interpreted as Bhutan leaning towards China. But is that really the case? So rather than say these are the reasons of Bhutanese leanings, I would like to problematize the question and say what makes one suggest that there is a leaning. Two things hereafter will remain key in Bhutan's democratic discourse. Whether we talk about socio-economic development, whether we talk about foreign policy, whether we talk about engagement with multilateral organizations, NGOs, the regional, worldwide, Bhutan's sort of a psyche will always be anchored on the long and well-cultivated relationship with India that takes cognizance not only of existing mutual needs, but needs that could diversify. Two, as I said, China, a global power and a neighbor, is an entity, a country that we just cannot pretend not to exist. As our Honorable Ambassador, and we are having a conversation this morning, we look towards the north, we have the mountains. We look towards the south, we have the plains. And in traditional Bhutanese articulation, the plains of India have always ignited this expression called the land of the Buddha, or Jagar Phakpil. The mountains have been seen as a barrier. It's a landlocked country. Where is the future? Our access to international markets, largely through India. So, interactions are our engagements with China that may be not direct at the moment. Yes, we have direct engagement when we talk about boundary issues, bilateral issues, in multilateral forums. But I think the confidence must be there, not just between the two governments, India and Bhutan, but between the peoples of India and Bhutan, is that the conduct of Bhutan's domestic or foreign policy, whether it's towards China, whether it's towards Japan, whether it's towards African countries or elsewhere, will always be mindful of the fact that our relationship with India that has matured, needs to be promoted, will be the basis of conducting these relations. Thank you, sir.
Gentleman here, and then after that, the gentleman in the back.
Yeah. Thank you. This question, my name is Sanjeev Dua. Jay, this is a question for you. I realized that when Dr. Kinga spoke about, it was something very interesting. He talked about involvement of monks in governance. And you know, communalism is a big word in India, and probably, you know, sometimes it's stretched. What's your view, taking the learnings from Bhutan, and can we bring it into India and probably make it a more logical society than we have?
Well, as I understood from what Dr. Kinga was saying, initially the monastic order was prevented from voting. And I think we don't have that issue because here every citizen is allowed to vote, irrespective of their religious affiliation or whatever else. But we do have certain provisions in the Constitution regarding misusing religion when it comes to electoral politics. My view is very straightforward, actually. I think our Constitution is strong in this matter, and I don't think there is scope for misusing that unless there is laxity in enforcement. Fortunately, some of the institutions in our country which had either not developed fast enough, early enough, have done so in recent years. The Election Commission, for instance, in the last 15 or 18 years, has built up a really solid reputation, not just domestically, but also helping elections in many, many other countries. So I'm not at all pessimistic about this. I think in another context, when Dr. Kinga was talking about 63 channels beaming to Bhutan, you know, we have about 12 times of that beaming into India. Of course, we're more diverse, many more languages. But this boom in information, not just television, but also in print media, also the rapidly advancing availability of the internet and social media, all of these things are great for democracies. The more information you make available to people, the more education you make available to people, as you're doing in Bhutan, I think these are great for democracy. So I'm a long-term optimist and a short-term problem solver.
Mr. Chairman, my name is Anand Jha. Just two brief questions to Dr. Kinga. First of all, especially in the light of the concern you've expressed that which exists in Bhutan about your environmental problems also. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. The first issue on whether, in the light of climate change, global warming, whether hydropower will continue to be a major economic engagement for Bhutan. We are optimistic that the global warming will be compassionate and slow its heating up of the ecosystem. But jokes aside, one of the major concerns of the Bhutan establishment that it intends to actively pursue in different regional and global forums is the issue of climate change and global warming. And our perspective on it is not merely shadowed by possible impact on glacial melting, no rivers being there to fuel our power turbines. I think our perspectives are more holistic than that. In fact, the whole concern on environment as a living entity and of the interdependence of various forms of life that we draw from our spiritual heritage, Buddhism, shapes our vision and our thinking. However, being optimistic, hydropower projects are something that even the present government is committed to doing, and indeed with the assistance of the government of India. This is something, so we have one senior CEO of a power company who says, more than the river running dry because of global warming, we should be concerned about fossil fuels being depleted earlier than rivers running dry. But even car makers, companies who thrive on fossil fuel are not really concerned so much at the moment about them resources being depleted and continues to get an economy going around it. So why not hydropower and rivers in Bhutan? But definitely that will be a continuous engagement. The latest updates on Bhutan and China's boundary talks. As a chairperson of the National Council and as a House of Review Even I'm waiting for a briefing from the government. I'm not the government. If I were the foreign minister, I would be in the best position to explain that. But nevertheless, we have had, since 1980s, lots of boundary talks with China. And these boundary talks have, many people think, not made progress, but there are progresses made. And it is not something that Bhutan is wishing to rush and draw a conclusion to earlier. We would be mindful of areas that we need to pay attention to, because Bhutan's boundary is not just a boundary between China, it's an international border, and it has its implications. But again, sir, I'm waiting for a briefing from the government myself. Thank you.
We'll take one last question from the gentleman at the back.
Excellency, my name is Rajesh Malhotra, and from all that you've said this evening, you've been talking about great leadership, great people who've been governing your wonderful country, and I'm an admirer of this. My question is, how do you get great people to come up and govern? How do you make them come through? And I would really like to understand this, because perhaps we, even though we are a very large country, could actually emulate that and ensure that not so nice people don't come into the picture.
Mr. Malhotra, I do not think this is the best question to end this interaction with today, because I'm not going to convince you. And the easiest way to explain is these are accidents of history and we have been lucky, but I know that doesn't convince you. Great leadership. Day after tomorrow, I have another seminar in Bangkok on Buddhist kingship and Buddhist leadership. And although monarchy was established only in 1907, just over 100 years ago, the idea of a leader and the idea of a Buddhist leader, and I'm not being partisan or religiously biased in that sense, Buddhism has been Bhutan's spiritual tradition. The idea of a leader as one who combines three characteristics. Primary one, wisdom. Second, compassion. And third, the ability to do things. However, kingship, and by extension, leadership that goes not just to members of parliament, but to the panchayat, so to say, at the local government. There is a basis of how we imagine and also construct a semblance of a Buddhist leader with minimum expectations, although realization may be difficult. Let me elucidate what I really mean. So, for example, when the first Buddhist government was established in 1626, and earlier there were Buddhist leaders, rulers in smaller valley-based communities, everyone, I think societies across time, are always suspicious of power, are always suspicious of people in power. Power can be exercised arbitrarily, it can be unpredictable, and that is not something that people in society are happy with. You always look for ways and means to temper and moderate that power so that deployment of power and coercive elements become predictable, become more tempered. The Buddhist trick was not constitution and external check and balance, or separation of powers, or separating religion and politics. The Buddhist trick was really to infuse those in authority with morality based on dharma. That's why the idea of a secular ruler enthused with values of morality became a minimum sort of assurance that the public official will conduct righteously. Of course, most of the time that would remain an ideal. Now, but then ideal has to be approximated. So in 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, when we had lay leaders increasingly coming to power, the idea that they must also discharge public service through that sort of an image of a leader was very compelling. So when someone became a leader those days, they had to take a monastic name. They had to take a basic, minimum monastic vow. And in some cases, when they reached the particular positions, for the time being, but not for a long time. They would stay away from their wives as leaders. So there was this attempt to approximate to the ideal leader. Now today, if you visit Bhutan's parliament, and of course, Bhutanese society, I'm sure you have done that, many people call it a colorful democracy because you see us wearing different colors of scarves. So you have His Majesty wearing yellow, ministers wearing orange, senior bureaucrats wearing red, judges wearing blue, and there's layers of gradation of scarves bearing correspondence to certain positions and responsibilities. Of course, the misuse of that has made society a bit cynical or suspicious of authority. But the real attempt, what we are even doing unconsciously, is trying to approximate the idea of a Buddhist leader. Because all these colors, firstly, have direct correspondence, what we call the 5 primary Buddhas. So the 5 primary colors. But more than that, all these scarves, colored scarves, are worn by members of monastic community to demonstrate certain level of realization as well as certain responsibilities. So this may not be working, but that hopefully would work. And that is a symbolic reminder and an approximation of a leader that will be less haughty. We wear swords, not as a mark of authority, but really as a symbol of cutting down on your ego. So there are symbols, there are things that we even today try to approximate, and that is informed by a historical basis and a religious tradition. Whether it will work or not, I do not know, but hopefully we would still like to be lucky, and perhaps perhaps an arrangement in a democratic polity will give rise to better leaders as well. Thank you, sir.
Perhaps we can take one last question. I know there are a few hands up, but we'll have to cap it at this in the interest of time. Just a quick last one.
Thank you, sir. Myself, J. Banerjee. My main identity is I spent 8 years in Bhutan. Kuzu Sambola. Two things about the interaction with China. Bhutan's history says that it always did interaction, with Buddhism, not directly, most of the time, not directly from India, but it is via Tibet.
Yeah.
Guru Padmasambhava came to Takshang monastery, I think is still the historical evidence. He came from that side, not from Indian side. So interaction with China is nothing new. It has been there in Bhutanese history since long. Number two, sir, I want to ask one thing. That is, I spent 8 years in technical education in Bhutan.
Okay.
So I have observed that primary and school education in Bhutan has been very strong when I was there. And I think transition to democracy, the main reason is the strong education system your third king built during the 60s and the 70s. The free food system was there. My question is, are you still continuing that? The feeding program in the schools, which is more akin to our midday meal system.
Thank you.
It was very much effective there. My question is, are you still continuing that?
The feeding
If
program.
not, yes. If not, I request you to please continue that. My thinking is the success of democracy, transition of the people from agriculture to the modern system, that was the main reason. Main reason is that.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you, Mr. Banerjee. I think the first was a statement about how Bhutan's interactions with China is not a new development, but a historical happening. So, for example, we talk today as China. Bhutan's interactions has largely been with Tibet. Even the founder of Bhutan actually came from Tibet. Guru Padmasambhava, his nationality is very difficult to be defined, although we say he comes from Swat Valley in Pakistan. But he transcends nationality and boundaries. He lived for 900 years, traveled all over the South Asian countries. Let us not historicize this person. I'm talking about Shabdrung Ngawang Namgyal, the founder of Bhutanese polity, who actually established a national polity in opposition to not the Chinese, but the Tibetan power then. But school feeding program. I go to my constituency every now and then, the largest constituency with about 63,000 people. And during my interactions with them, one of the most prominent articulation of what we call request in inverted commas, but it's really a demand from a new state, is to continue the feeding program and have the feeding program in communities where no feeding programs are there. I'll give you a classic example of my village. In the last parliament, I served as the deputy chairperson. The finance minister was from my village. We are just neighbors. But the school feeding program in our country, in our village, in the village school, was withdrawn the very year we were elected. And then the two of us became the object of ridicule and criticism by our village people, saying, we have our deputy chairperson, we have our ministers. Now suddenly, at the, right after the election, the feeding program gets lifted and gets sent to somewhere else. Anecdote aside, feeding program, especially with the support of the World Food Program, has been a successful program. There has been suggestions that this would be gradually phased out, but a commitment has been made that it will continue for some time. And as you think, as you argue, so do I believe that in the 60s, 70s, when many children of peasants attended schools, WFP food were not just food, it was an incentive to study. There was a comparatively better nutrition and source of diet. I think this would remain true even in some remote communities, even in my own constituency. This is something we would like to carry forward. We would try, but if you have ways of supporting it, please do so. We'll welcome that. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Thank you for that wonderfully candid and wise discussion about Bhutan and relations in the neighborhood. I think all of us had a fascinating evening. And in conclusion, I'd only like to say that we often like to think that as a large democracy, we have lots to teach the world about democracies. But I think today, we've learned a thing or two about democratization. And thank you for that.
Thank you, sir.
Request you all for a big hand.
Thank you, sir.